This is MichMash, a weekly conversation where we try to unjumble an important and sometimes under-the-radar statewide story that affects you. I'm Cheyna Roth.
And I'm Alethia Kasben. Republicans in Michigan and across the country are calling for requirements that voters prove their citizenship before registering to vote. Non-citizens are already prohibited from voting, and those studying the issue say non-citizens voting is an isolated and rare occurrence. But conservatives want to see a stricter requirement for how we prove citizenship.
Now, election officials from both parties have actually raised concerns about this, essentially saying it could be difficult to administer and potentially lead to those who are qualified and legally able to vote to be blocked from doing so. Secretary of State Jocelyn Benson, who is a Democrat, is among those opposed to the local and federal efforts to require documentation proving citizenship. Here's what she told us recently about the issue.
So I'll be clear, I'm not against, I do support proof of citizenship. What I have actually said is we already do evaluate citizenship when someone is registering to vote, particularly through our offices. And so adding additional requirements, especially the onerous ones in the SAVE Act, that among other things would require the name on a resident's birth certificate to match the name on a voter registration form, that to me is not a reasonable requirement. It is a dangerous requirement that would have a significant impact on eligible U.S. citizens in Michigan and across the country, including 2.2 million women in Michigan who don't have IDs that match their birth certificate because they're married. And so for me, it's really important in this moment to have cross-partisan and bipartisan conversations about how to continue to improve the security of our elections, but use data-driven decision-making, not politically driven decision-making, to address any issues that people might have.
Those pushing this proposal disagree, however. Rep. Brian Posthumus, a Republican from West Michigan, is leading the charge here. Part of the reason the issue is gaining some steam in Michigan is a non-citizen did vote in the 2024 election. However, it was caught by election officials, and he is facing criminal penalties and potentially deportation. Still, Posthumus says he was spurred to act, and now he has a proposal that would amend the Constitution to require proof of citizenship to vote. It does not specify what that would look like, though, and this leaves it up to a future legislature to put those requirements into place if voters did adopt this amendment.
And in the state legislature, let's be real, this plan is doomed. A 2/3 majority of both the House and Senate would need to approve the resolution to put the amendment on the ballot for voters to decide. Democrats strongly oppose the measure. However, advocates could collect signatures to get the proposal on the ballot that way.
Right, and they would need to collect more than 440,000 valid signatures for the proposal to put it before voters in 2026. If this does make the ballot, though, it would be an interesting test. In recent years, voters in Michigan have overwhelmingly approved constitutional amendments making it easier to access voting. Some of the things already approved by voters in previous years would be undone by a requirement to show proof of citizenship.
Now let's talk about what proof of citizenship means. For many voters, this would not include a regular driver's license. A voter would need to have a birth certificate, passport, or real ID to prove citizenship. On the federal level, Congress is debating the SAVE Act, which explicitly requires those documents to register to vote.
And like we said at the top, there are some concerns. Some argue many voters don't have access to these documents. About half of Americans have passports. There could be an issue with married women who change their names. Their birth certificates won't list the name they are trying to register under, though, of course, they could have their marriage license with their birth certificate to potentially solve that issue. And some are saying there should just be a federal database to help local election officials prove citizenship, and then the voter wouldn't have to worry about showing those documents at all.
The fate of these proposals in Michigan and nationally is very up in the air. It's a long road ahead if any proposal were to appear on the 2026 ballot in the state. And while President Donald Trump has called for stricter voting requirements, it's unclear what might happen in the U.S. Senate in particular. We're going to take a short break here, but stick around because when we come back, we're going to bring on Secretary of State Jocelyn Benson to talk about her gubernatorial run, voting laws, and so much more. Welcome back to MichMash. I'm Cheyna Roth.
And I'm Alethia Kasben. Today we are joined by Secretary of State Jocelyn Benson, who recently announced she is seeking the Democratic nomination for governor in 2026. Secretary Benson, thanks so much for joining us today.
Happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
Let's start with your recent announcement that you're running for governor in 2026. Why did you decide to jump into the race now? It's still somewhat early days.
I love my job as Michigan Secretary of State, in part because I get to interact with residents all across Michigan and demonstrate every day that government can work well for all of us. And so for me, it was really important to take a minute, especially after this most recent election, and go on a tour around the state to talk to folks, which I did in December and in January, about how to make sure all of state government worked this well. And really also what lessons we could take away from the 2024 election. And what I heard in every corner of the state was not just folks desperately want a government that will be less bureaucratic and more efficient, and our offices are an example of that, but they also want leaders who are going to take on big fights, stand up to keep our residents safe, and also really get things done when it comes to making housing more affordable, childcare more affordable and accessible, and again, make it easier for folks to just put food on the table in times like these. So for all those reasons, I felt a sense of urgency to ensure that I could step up, and in a moment where we do need to know what the next decade is going to be for our state, be able to provide that vision along with my track record for getting things done, so that we can build the type of cross-partisan coalition and support we will need statewide to not just win in November, but govern well.
So, Governor Gretchen Whitmer is term limited and cannot seek re-election. She, of course, is a fellow Democrat. Elections after a sitting governor has served 8 years in Michigan are often sort of seen as a change election. Voters tend to want to switch parties. Do you see it as a sort of change year? And what, would you like to change about government operations?
Well, to me, as I've traveled around Michigan for these last few years, and have served, residents in all of our branch offices across the state, it's been really clear that there's no partisan or Republican or Democratic way to serve the people of Michigan well. It's just about doing things efficiently, effectively, cutting through red tape and bureaucracy, and delivering results. So, as someone who's proudly run and won statewide in this state several times, I've done so by making the case to all voters, Democrats, Republicans, and independents alike, that I know how to run large institutions like our state government in an effective, efficient way that will save all of our residents time and money. When I see someone in a branch office, I don't ask them who they voted for. I just ask how I can help make their lives easier. And if you look at what makes, in my view, the type of statewide candidates, what makes a statewide candidate successful, or the type of candidates that have been successful in Michigan, regardless of party affiliation, it's those who are able to deliver results across the board and really save residents time and money. And, I'm not a pundit, so I can't pretend to, predict what's going to happen in the future from a political standpoint. But I do know is that we've seen some consistent, strong wins from the Democratic Party over time, particularly over the last several years, with women like Alyssa Slotkin and Kristen McDonald-Rivet, leaders who are talking to all residents about how to save them time, save them money, and make government work a little better for them. That's my track record as well in this state. And my hope is that the residents of Michigan will recognize not just my commitment to making their lives easier, but also my track record for doing so. And I believe that will be a recipe for success in November 2026.
Democrats in general seem a little lost right now. What do you think the party needs to do to just sort of regroup after President Donald Trump's win in November?
I think, first, I think it's important to remember Democrats did have some incredibly important wins in Michigan in 2024. Senator Alyssa Slotkin, who just showed the nation the grit and determination and bipartisan approach that successful Michigan leaders take to doing our jobs well, is an example of that. Congresswoman Kristen McDonald-Rivet, Justice Kyra Harris-Bolden, Justice Kim Thomas, all won their races by significant margins, despite a national trend toward Republican candidates. And so I think it's important to note that, but undoubtedly also what Democrats need to do better is listen and take action. And so for me, that's why immediately after the 2024 election, I started going across the state and just hosting conversations with local leaders to hear from people about what's on their minds, and found a through line of people who are scared of not just the impact of what a second Trump term might bring to Michigan, but also scared in a moment like this of their personal safety, of the potential leaders trampling on their hard-won rights and freedoms, and also people who are concerned about the cost of living. And number one thing I heard was people worried about whether they could afford a home for their family in the community that they wanted to live in. So in my view, it's, as someone who's been dedicated not just to making government work better, but making sure every voice is heard in our state. As governor, I'll make sure we are listening to every resident and delivering results that directly will address the rising cost of living in our state and across the country, the housing crisis, access to quality childcare, and above all, making sure that we are taking on the fact that a third of jobs in this state are salaries of $50,000 or less. And with stagnant wages and rising costs, we need leaders across the board who will deliver results to cut costs and invest in an economy that will lead to higher wages. So as we do all those things, I think those are the things Democrats have done well, and certainly Democratic leaders are committed to. And so in this moment, it's required upon all of us to listen more, do more, deliver results, and really deliver results that will make everyone's life easier, Democrat, Republican, and Independents.
So, as we all know, Mike Duggan is running as an independent. If he, does make the ballot and follows through, with running as a third party candidate, is that just the end for whoever the Democratic nominee is? Could the Democratic nominee for governor win with Mike Duggan polling votes from Detroit as an independent?
Yeah, again, I'm not a pundit and I don't pretend to be one, but I also know that we are in a moment where political leaders with courage are of short supply. And I think it's really important that we as Democrats and as Michiganders support and elect leaders who are honest and going to stand up and live by our shared values, and who are willing to be courageous and do the right thing always, and not try to run or hide from who we are because it's politically expedient to do so. And so for me, this is my fourth statewide campaign. Every time I've been on the ballot, I've gained support from more voters throughout the state, Democrats, Republicans, and Independents. In 2022, just 3 years ago, I won by 14 points, including winning 2 counties on the west side of the state that no Democrats had won. So I know how to build cross-partisan coalitions to support and win statewide and also govern well. And as the CEO of one of the state's largest agencies, I also have a track record of working with reasonable leaders on both sides of the aisle to get things done. And so for me, we've gotten bills to the legislature where others have fallen short, and that track record of success, I believe, will continue to resonate to all voters and put us in a prime position to succeed and win next fall, no matter who else is on the ballot.
So on top of running for governor, you are currently, as we've mentioned, the Secretary of State. And I wanted to ask you about election security. This has been sort of a lingering topic for years now. You have said that you're against proof of citizenship, which has been proposed on the federal level with the SAVE Act and a proposed constitutional amendment here. What are your concerns about this?
So I'll be clear. I'm not against, well, I do support proof of citizenship. What I have actually said is we already do evaluate citizenship when someone is registering to vote, particularly through our offices. And so adding additional requirements, especially the onerous ones in the SAVE Act, that among other things would require the name on a resident's birth certificate to match the name on a voter registration form, that to me is not a reasonable requirement. It is a dangerous requirement that would have a significant impact on eligible U.S. citizens in Michigan and across the country, including 2.2 million women in Michigan who don't have IDs that match their birth certificate because they're married. And so for me, it's really important in this moment to have cross-partisan and bipartisan conversations about how to continue to improve the security of our elections, but use data-driven decision-making, not politically driven decision-making, to to address any issues that people might have. I don't think we need to take a chainsaw to democracy to improve its security and integrity. We're doing quite well in Michigan with secure and accessible elections, but at the same time, happy to work with lawmakers and stakeholders and clerks and election officials to actually develop improvements to the system that won't also unilaterally disenfranchise large swaths of our residents and citizens and criminalize innocent acts of election officials to further some sort of political agenda or conspiracy theory.
So as you know, in 2024, a non-citizen did vote in Michigan, and Republicans, are pointing to this as a reason why, we need more, these requirements to prove citizenship, to bring certain documentation in. What is your response to that? And I know you recently had a press conference about supporting some changes in this realm to, prevent that from happening. What do you think should be done?
Well, I think we need to have, again, honest conversations across the aisle with how to actually address specific issues at hand. You're always going to have instances, as the one you reference, where people lie about their citizenship, and you have to have pieces in place to address when people do try to defraud the system. In this case, you had someone who lied at multiple times about their citizenship status, allegedly, and that is now and was caught, and now that is going through the court system. But we do have to, I think, there are things we can do, and we've proposed an Election Security Act that we're working with lawmakers to have introduced that will actually address those specific instances of someone who registers in a satellite office on election day and adding perhaps additional pieces and requirements there. So those are the conversations I'm happy to have with lawmakers, because I agree we do need to make it easier to vote while making it harder to cheat. And when we have isolated examples, like one in 5.7 million, as we did in 2024 or back in 2018, even under my predecessor, I think it is important for us to work together to ensure, even in those isolated rare circumstances, that they don't repeat. But again, we don't need to take a chainsaw to the entire system in order to do that and put onerous burdens on other voters to address isolated incidents. There's much more targeted things we can do, and that's what we'll be talking with the legislature and clerks about, because we have to make sure any policies we do introduce and put into place, clerks have a stake in helping to draft and craft and then ultimately implement in order for them to be successful.
What did you make of Governor Whitmer vetoing bills late last year that would have let the Board of State Canvassers conduct statistical sampling on candidate petitions? Did you agree with this move?
No, we've been very clear about the importance. I mean, there's a lot of things we need to do to modernize our election system and our signature gathering process and petition process. And that's something that we have been working with the State Board of Canvassers on. And so we were surprised at that particular move, but that won't, of course, deter us from continuing to try to move things forward and modernize our system of both petition gathering and signature evaluation. I think we'll see more of that in the years ahead, and I think it will and can be part of a comprehensive package to address and improve the integrity of the signature gathering process and the petition process.
So right now we're waiting on a special election to be called in the 35th Senate District. So governors, have the ability to call a special election essentially on whatever, timetable they choose when there's a vacancy. Do you agree with that process? Would a change that sort of sets more concrete parameters, would that take politics sort of out of this decision?
Well, I do, as an administrator of elections who works with our clerks, I do think you have contextual decisions to make when it comes to calling special elections. I'm all for objective and data-driven decision making, as well as the policies that would create more clarity and consistency. But there's also times, particularly when it comes to special elections or unexpected circumstances, where you do need to have a subjective element as well, as we have here. So I think, all that to say, from a process standpoint, it's one that has typically worked well when decisions like this are made with stakeholders at the table that can help weigh all considerations, including setting the date, making sure with early voting and everything else, if early voting is in place or voting from home, that you have the pieces in place to operationalize that for the residents of the community. So all those factors need to be taken into consideration. And to me, there's a hybrid system that could work, where you have both those objective factors required to be taken into consideration with also a subjective element that looks at the broader context. But all that to say is, here it's the governor's purview in this moment, and we're waiting to hear. And as soon as we know and we have that clarity, we'll move forward to make sure the election goes well and smoothly.
Secretary of State Jocelyn Benson and Democratic gubernatorial candidate Jocelyn Benson, thank you so much for joining us here on MichMash.
Thanks for having me.